My name's Darren Robinson, and it's my absolute pleasure to be here presenting on day 2 of Developer Days 2024. Even more of a pleasure to be actually here at SailPoint in Austin, Texas. After the last few years of doing these things remotely, it's great to be back with the community, and as you've seen this week, it is all about community. My session today is Say Goodbye to Restless Nights, Unleashing Your Inner IdentityNow Developer, and it's going to be quite a journey over the next 90 minutes as we take a little bit of a look into the past, a little bit of guidance on what you should be thinking about in 2024 if you're new to IdentityNow and developing on the IdentityNow platform, and then a look into the future on where I've been doing a reasonable amount of work to try and make life a little bit easier for those new developers coming into the ecosystem and trying to understand how to develop solutions on IdentityNow and interact with the APIs. A little bit about me. I'm based in Sydney, Australia. I am the Global Principal Identity and Access Management Architect for Avanade, a global SI, about 65,000 people globally, and I look after a lot of what we do in terms of new assets, partnerships, and technologies and large-scale implementations of identity and access management solutions. I've been in the industry for 30 years, and probably the better part of that I've been doing identity and access management solutions. So a lot of today is a lot of learnings, a lot of experience, but a lot of this is also targeted at new people coming in. But there's something here for everyone. If you are a seasoned identity developer, if you have done a lot of work with other products in the past, there'll be still something here for you, and especially in the latter part of the session when I start talking about using AI to assist us with getting to grips with complex APIs or things we haven't seen, or just to do things a lot more efficient than what we've had to in the past. So here's an overview of today's session. We are going to talk, like I said, a little bit about the past, some of the history of where we've come from. I'm going to provide a little bit of guidance around what I recommend if you're starting out new in this environment. And then we're going to get into the pretty much more than 50% of this presentation is going to be demo. And I take you through the journey that I've been through over the last 6 months and working out how we can use AI to speed up our work as developing against IdentityNow. So with that in mind, APIs, IdentityNow, and my favorite topic, PowerShell. I am the author of the first sort of unofficial, some call it an SDK, I call it a PowerShell module for SailPoint IdentityNow. It was something that I built starting in around 2017 to be used by our support teams that were supporting IdentityNow implementations. Our support teams aren't as technical as some of us architects and consultants, and they were having difficulties interacting with the platform and doing orchestration of IdentityNow. So they needed a way to be able to simply do it with the skills they had and the ability to get simple tasks done quickly. So I developed a PowerShell module and started building out those capabilities based on what they needed to do. Fast forward about 4 or 5 years, that module became the go-to for orchestration of IdentityNow via PowerShell, which is what most IT pros use, and it's been used and referenced sort of everywhere. It is getting a little bit long in the tooth these days, but it's still very relevant. It's not as current as it probably needs to be, but then there are also alternatives today. And some of those are what I've got listed on the screen here. So if you're starting out today with IdentityNow and you're looking to orchestrate it or interact with it with PowerShell, then you've got options. You've got the CLI, the command line interface, in conjunction with the PowerShell SDK, simplifies the approach to being able to orchestrate, query, report, or even do changes and updates into IdentityNow. There is still my open source PowerShell module that is still available. I still do take pull requests for that if there's additional functionality that people want. That said, I haven't developed any of the new capabilities that are in IdentityNow. I haven't developed commandlets for them, simply because there are now other options which are more current. And of course, you can also still build your own. You can mix and match a number of these. I've been talking to a number of the presenters that are here this week, and a lot of them have been looking at what I've done in the past, taking that as a reference, and then making it better and building their own tools and solutions around that. So these are all options for you. If I was starting out today, I would be looking to use a combination of the SDK and CLI, simply because it simplifies the authentication and provides you a base to get started with. And it's a bit of a fast track to getting that first foray into developing for IdentityNow or orchestrating IdentityNow with. But it doesn't really matter what approach you take, whether you build your own, whether you're using a CLI, one of the open source modules. For things like get and list, it's all very simple. You make a request, you get the objects back. That's what it is. Like any sort of get operations, get me an access profile, get me an account, get me a source. Those are all very simple operations, and everything does that relatively well. But when you start stepping past that and you want to do things like create or update objects, that's where things get a little bit more difficult, because the objects that you're dealing with have a very prescriptive structure that you've got to provide in order to be able to do that update or to do that create. You need to be able to provide to the through the tooling that you're using, the syntax that's required with the appropriate structure and object types in order for it to be successful. And that's where we need some help. Anyone that I've ever talked to that's integrated with any new API or platform, there's a learning curve into actually interacting with it and getting familiar with the syntax and making that work. So today, I'm going to go through a few options that can make that a lot easier. It doesn't matter whether you're a seasoned developer or an IT pro or someone that's just starting out. There are definitely options. So my approach, if you are starting today in 2024, think about what it is that you're going to be doing. You may have an immediate need to get some information out, or do a simple update in. Where is that going to go? What's the next request going to be? So sort of plan ahead. Think about what you're going to need to do and create a foundation or a framework on how you're going to do that the next time someone asks. Simplify the authentication. Simplify how you're going to reuse and repurpose snippets of code or modules within your toolkit to allow you to quickly do that. And that's where leveraging the CLI and the SDK can help you. This simplifies a lot of the early barriers just to actually interacting with those platforms. In the next slide, I'm going to talk about some of the complexities we've had in the past, but my recommendation for the future, if you're starting out, is to start with the CLI and SDK. Don't get me wrong, these two are relatively new. It was this time last year in the keynote with Jordan that I had the pleasure of being part of that announcement where the CLI and the PowerShell SDK came to life. Those are auto-generated, and they generate a commandlet for every API that's in the platform, which is great. But that also means there's an API for every platform, for every function in the platform, which means there's hundreds. And that can be quite difficult to navigate. But for authentication, the abstraction that these two provide is just absolutely foundational. If you take the authentication and authorization out of the way up front, then really it's a case of what are you trying to achieve, what are you trying to do, what are you trying to query, what are you trying to update, and how you're going to do that. So for simple tasks, even then, the CLI and SDK are great. Once you find the commandlet that you need for whatever the capability is that you're interfacing with, then it's relatively easy to do that get operation. But for creating and updating and doing modifiers or doing very bulk operations, then you're probably better off to write your own. And that's where some of what I'm talking about today will assist you getting there a lot quicker. So a little bit of a sort of a step back in time. I've mentioned if you're starting today, you've got the benefit of using modern tools that have been provided now by SailPoint. You've also got the community contributions as well. And like I said, even the legacy one that I've wrote a number of years ago is still very pertinent today. There are a number of, there's been quite a heritage in the way that the APIs around IdentityNow have evolved. So historically, there was the original IdentityNow portal, but there wasn't a lot of documentation around the APIs that were behind it. The initial thinking and premise was that the IdentityNow portal was everything you ever needed. You did everything through the portal. There wasn't the concept of maybe doing bulk operations or scaling this beyond what it was capable of at the time. It was very much, it was in the early stages of the product, and if you're implementing it in an enterprise, you wanted to do things at scale. So we needed to interact with a number of the APIs. There were V1, beta, and private APIs at that time. Those have now evolved to V2 and V3. Likewise, the authentication, that was very rudimentary in the early days, and I think there's still some Compass articles floating around that talk about taking the session cookie out of the admin session in the portal, putting that in as your bearer token, and then making your API calls, which are good for about 12 minutes. If you create a client ID and client secret through the admin portal, then that gives you currently today will give you an OAuth modern authentication mechanism and give you a 60-minute session, likewise for a personal access token. But one more step back in time, these didn't even exist for the authentication. So like I just talked about, having to take a session cookie, put it into your little script that you were running, and then you got a number of minutes to be able to do some orchestration outside of the portal. You couldn't actually create a script and do authentication without using the portal. So that's where I actually had to reverse engineer one of the professional services tools that allowed you to do a bulk upload into IdentityNow at the time to work out how that was doing authentication and how they were achieving that for their purpose so that I could do something similar. And it was a case of actually reverse engineering one of their Java libraries in order to work out how they did that, reverse engineering how they were doing the encryption, and then writing my own to do that. So that's something that that was a lot of pain back in the time. It was a little bit maybe even naughty, but now you've got all these modern methods to do that. And using the SDK, the CLI, a way of actually storing configurations for different environments. So we've come a long way, and we're still also at the beginning with what we can be, what we will be able to do with IdentityNow moving forward. So one last thing about authentication. We need to make sure that the credentials that we're using to authenticate to IdentityNow are stored in a secure mechanism or a secure manner. So depending on what platform and how you're interacting or how you're orchestrating IdentityNow, have a think about ways that you can use to secure those credentials. Do not put your client ID and your client secret or your PAT ID client ID or your PAT client secret into your scripts. If you are orchestrating IdentityNow through PaaS services on cloud platforms like, say, Azure and Azure Functions or Logic Apps, you can store your credentials in the Azure Key Vault and then use managed identity to retrieve those credentials when those processes start up, get the credential, and then go and perform your task. Your script runs, it will pull the most recent version and can still authenticate and still work. If you're doing things locally, think about using a password manager. I personally am a big fan of 1Password. I do store my personal address tokens, personal access tokens in my 1Password manager. And I've actually written a PowerShell module as a wrapper for 1Password that lets me programmatically retrieve those credentials from scripts out of my password vault, which is local on my machine. So I've got the benefit of having a password manager, but I can still also do orchestration of other systems by retrieving that credential for the session. If you're on Windows, you also have the export CLI XML command. What this lets you do is if you do a get credential PowerShell command, it will ask you for a username and password. That will be your client ID and client secret. You can then export that to the local file system using export CLI XML. And what that does on Windows is uses the secure configuration of Windows to mean that you can only bring back in that that file using import CLI XML, you can only do that on the machine where that credential was saved to that file on, and only under the user context that was saved. So if that file's moved to another machine, you can import the file, but you cannot unencrypt the secrets that are inside it. Same if you are doing it as a different user on the same machine, you can't do it. So only on the same context, the same user, or the same profile on the same machine can actually reverse the encryption of the protected credentials in order to use them. So think about that. Think about how you're going to secure that. Do not use keep your secrets in your scripts. That will come and bite you very quick. So AI. It's 2024. AI is everywhere. If you haven't heard of AI, then you're probably living under a rock, and maybe you're in the wrong industry. But how can we use this for coding? And why would we want to use that for coding? Well, it's 2024, not 2018. Like I said, when I was starting out with IdentityNow, there was no sort of helper. The documentation was there, but it was minimal. And there were no real specifications around the APIs we're talking to. There was example endpoints and an example document from a point in time at which the API may have been originally created. But there were also lots that were undocumented as well. Today, 2024, we've got maturing APIs and we've got examples. This is a screenshot from the developer community, and you can see that we've got a create access profile spec for the API for IdentityNow. This specifies the endpoint of the API, specifies a request, it gives an example of creating a request to create an access profile, and also gives us spec around what the API expects, what is optional, and that gives you a good heads up around what is possible and what you need to provide in order to achieve what you're trying to do for each API. So we're going to look into this, and we're going to be coming back to this as part of the demos later in this presentation, but we're going to come back to it a lot because this is effectively our guiding path. In no way is it always perfect, but it's a lot better than we've ever had before, and it will still get you there a lot quicker than if you're not even referencing these docs and you're just trying the trial and error method. And finally, AI was not going to replace you. A person using AI will. So I highly encourage you, if you haven't looked at using AI for your daily work, whether it's through other co-pilots or some of what I'm going to show you today, I highly encourage you to investigate these technologies, keep abreast of the capabilities that are there, and start working with it so that you understand it, and you will be the star on your team. So this is where AI can really start to assist us, because if you are new to looking at these APIs and you're trying to do anything other than those get or list operations, like this is a create operation here, it's can be quite convoluted. And I think it's even more so in the screenshot that's been taken on my slide, because it looks like it's very, very jumbled from what I originally put. But the point I was trying to make with this is there's the syntax that you need to follow for the API you're talking to. There's a specific structure you need to provide in order to achieve that. And then there's all the criteria and the values and the types of values that you need to provide in order to be successful. Now, like I talked about, there's now guidance for each of the APIs on the developer, the SailPoint IdentityNow developer portal, but they also only talk around the beta and the v3 APIs. If you're going back and having to look at APIs that are still in use, which are v2 or private, then you're going to be having to jump into things like developer tools to look at seeing how the portal's doing that and trying to mimic that for what you need. So talking about coding and large language models, where do you start? There's a number of different options out there. If you do a search for anything AI, then all of a sudden all your ads on all your devices are going to be promoting all the different plethora of products which are targeting people that are trying to understand AI or use AI for their benefit. GitHub Copilot was probably one of the first that came out probably close to 3 years ago in the early previews, and that's using OpenAI codecs. And that's basically giving you like a peer programmer next to you that's doing a combination of IntelliSense and predicting what you're trying to do and giving you some guidance and structure and sort of type ahead capabilities, which is fantastic. There's also LM Studio. This is a relatively new release that came out last year. This is a client that sits on your machine. You can load a bunch of models into it and then do a whole myriad of different things. And we're going to explore that today in a couple of my demos. You've got OpenAI. I'm sure you've all used ChatGPT. That's very much a conversational generative AI type solution. I'll talk about that briefly, but we're not really going to do a demo on that because it's not going to give us what we need. And then I'm going to jump into the final one, which is around using sort of a hybrid approach of OpenAI with ChatGPT and LM Studio, sort of a combination of those, and see where that takes us. And that will be the basis of the majority of the demo at the latter part of the session that will get us to where we are. So there's a brief summary of sort of some of the options that exist. Again, I wrote this deck briefly before Christmas last year, or early part of this year. And since I've done that, quite a few things have changed. I updated this presentation a couple of weeks ago, and even between now and then there's been some subtle changes, some advancements, and the way that some of these capabilities are evolving is just astounding. So get in early, start having a mess around with these and see where it takes you. If you don't get in now, the learning curve is only going to be greater. But when you're doing that, there's some considerations to think about. Cost. Some large language models, some AI capabilities are free, some of them are paid. Some of them are open source, some of them are custom, some have fine-tuning of the large language models, and that can affect whether or not they cost money or whether they're free. Speed, this is a big one. As you know, large language models can be very resource intensive. They can use a lot of resources if you're running them locally. If they're running somewhere else, then someone else is footing the bill, and that can then infer back into the cost conversation. But the most important one, and what we're talking about today, a lot of it is accuracy. How can I use AI to get the desired result without having the expertise, knowledge on how to use APIs or how to create complex payloads for APIs in order to achieve what I'm trying to do. So a combination of accuracy, then speed, and then cost will probably be the order in which I would do it. I've put privacy on this slide as well, simply because you need to think about privacy in pretty much anything we're doing in computing these days. The good thing is, in this session, what I'm talking about is using AI to our benefit to create payloads for complex APIs or complex operations to make it easier for us. We're not dealing with authentication, we're not dealing with authorization or any of those types of things. We're abstracting that to the way that we're interacting with the platform versus actually doing the create operations. So really what we're doing is just creating the payloads for those complex pieces. There's not really a privacy concern there. So, PowerShell AI, unleashing your inner IdentityNow developer. Where do we start? So, I'm sure as all of you that have explored OpenAI before, you start with a prompt. You're asking a generative AI prompt for, what is the capital of a country, or what are the former presidents of a country, or something like that. And with a generative AI, you're not necessarily having to provide a lot of context. It's a general knowledge, conversational-based API, and it will give you a result. And if it doesn't give you a result, you can refine it, refine your question, give it some more context, and you'll probably get what you want. When we're doing this in a programmatic way, and we're doing it for languages to assist us with coding, we need to be more prescriptive around what we provide as the context and the background and what we expect the output to be from AI. So this is where we've got to generate a prompt that will help us help set the context so that the large language model can actually give us the result we need. we want to be creating functions that will build out our configuration payloads for interacting with IdentityNow. We can then maybe use our global variables for authentication as part of outside of that, but for the most part it's just the payload. We don't need to know about that. But we need to tell the large language model as part of its context and what we expect from it of what we want the output to look like. We want it to be able to give us very PowerShell specific capabilities around the parameters that we're going to provide, so that it can give us the right functions that will take the right object types to generate the payloads, give us pipeline support if we want to use the function in that way. Advanced techniques like splatting or using templates, they're all options that we need to provide as part of the prompt so that we get what we want. So here's an example prompt, and this is the one that I'm going to be using in the demos. This is one that I refined probably over the period of probably 4 to 6 weeks until I was getting some consistent results from a couple of different large language models trying to achieve the goal of using those to generate these payloads. So this is quite a long prompt, but it is, like I say, very specific in telling it what the scene is, what's the context, what you're going to do, and what you're going to give us back. So as a seasoned PowerShell scripting expert with over 18 years of hands-on experience in automation and system administration, you possess an in-depth understanding of crafting sophisticated scripts to automate mundane tasks, administer system configurations, and streamline overall administrative workflows. Your proficiency extends to PowerShell modules, commandlets, and the development of advanced functions. You boast a comprehensive knowledge of Windows operating systems and server environments. Your primary goal is to provide expert guidance on the creation of PowerShell scripts that are not only efficient and robust, but also prioritize security. Your expertise includes assisting users in harnessing the power of PowerShell for diverse applications such as data manipulation, system monitoring, and network management. You are well versed in the utilization of PowerShell features like splatting, parameter values, PS custom object templates, function parameters such as validate set, mandatory or optional, pipeline, and default values to enhance script capabilities and maintainability. Beyond basic scripting, your capabilities encompass integrating PowerShell seamlessly with various RESTful APIs and tools, thereby elevating its potential for handling complex automation solutions. Your knowledge extends to the best practices for script security, error handling, and optimization, ensuring that users can develop scripts that not only function flawlessly, but also adhere to the highest standards of quality and reliability. In summary, you're a go-to expert for anyone seeking to maximize the potential of PowerShell in their automation efforts, offering guidance that spans from fundamental scripting principles to advanced techniques for creating secure, efficient, and reliable automation solutions. So that's an absolute mouthful. I think if anyone had all those capabilities with all that experience, they would be amazing. And that's what we're expecting from our large language models. What we're utilizing it for today, for some of the payloads for IdentityNow APIs for doing creations, is probably just the tip of the iceberg. So I'm hoping that this prompt will have some longevity as we start using these to do more complex things than what I'm going to show today. But again, this is the beginning of the journey. This is the exciting thing, doing something that's fresh and new and working it out along the way. So once you've got a prompt, there's an example. We're going to see this in some of the demos, so I'm not going to dwell on that. Once we've given the context and set the prompt on what we are trying to achieve, what we're expecting as the results back from the language models, we've then got to give it something to do. So this is effectively, what are we asking it then? So this is the example that I'm going to be using in a number of the demos before we get to the real world example near the end of the presentation. Here is an example JSON object with sample values to create an access profile. Create a PowerShell function allowing for each parameter to be specified on the function using the correct object type, and generate an output object with the correct structure with support for elements with multiple values that can be converted to JSON and used programmatically to create a series of access profiles. So what we're going to be showing what I'm going to be showing in the demo is using large language models to create an access profile and an IdentityNow. So we've got the context, we've got what we expect, and then we're giving them an example of what it looks like. So this JSON flat file string here is effectively from the IdentityNow developer portal. It's the one that I had in the screenshot before. I'll show that shortly. And we're basically putting that in and saying, here is an example that SailPoint provide to create an access profile on their platform. Create me a function that will allow me to provide the value so that I can create my own access profile via the API rather than using the portal. So let's jump over to the demos. The first demo I am going to show is going to be using LM Studio. So LM Studio is a tool that you can download. It's an application. I'm showing it here on my screen. And here you can see that it's cross-platform. So it's available for Mac, Windows, and Linux. And it allows you to download it. If you're using it for your personal use and everything else, it's free. If you start to commercialize some of the reasons for what you're using it, then I think there is a cost involved. But we're in this experimental phase. We're just having a mess with the technology, trying to understand it. And I'm running it here on my Windows machine. So this is, I've downloaded it from this from their site, lmstudio.ai, and I've loaded it up here on my Windows machine. And this is what you see when you start it up. You've got this blank screen and you've got the search bar. So what this allows you to do is take large language models, bring them in locally to your machine, and then run your queries all locally. So when you're starting out, it's like, well, okay, I've got to choose a model. What large language model am I going to choose when I'm trying to have some assistance with coding using PowerShell against REST APIs? So there's a couple that exist. The one that I'm going to show first is one called CodeLlama. So if you have a search for this, there's a number of different results for here. So if you're new to large language models, this looks rather frightening, not understanding maybe some of the syntax or nomenclature associated with it. But basically, what it's sort of saying when you search for CodeLlama is each of these are different sizes, and that's different types of models. So when you're looking at something, you're trying to compare these two, for example, the CodeLlama 7B and the CodeLlama 7B Instruct. The difference between the two is if it doesn't say anything, then more than likely it's a generative or chat-based model. So that's like your ChatGPT. So that's good if you're asking it trivia questions or history questions or some of those types of things, or it can do predictive values for something that you're asking, based on past training. But for what we want the instruct models. Those are the ones that will give us instructions, it will give us guidance, it will use its knowledge and AI to actually give us results that we can use for developing and programming. In terms of the numbers, 7B versus 13B, that's the number of parameters that are associated with the model. That's how big the model is, and what the complexity of things that it can do. Typically, the size is also the size of the model that you'll need to download and have on your local host in order to use it. So a 7 billion parameter model is typically around about 3 gigabytes, and so when you go up in orders of 7 or so, then typically you're doubling or tripling that. So if I have a look at the, I've downloaded I've accessed 3 models on my LM Studio here. We've got DeepSeek Coder, and I've got the 6.7 billion parameter model of that, Instruct, like I was talking about just a minute ago, and I've also got CodeLlama. So each of these are around about the 2-3 gig. So that's the DeepSeek, and then we're going here, 3.7. So immediately, when you start to do large language models, AI, on your local host, you've got to think about what you're going to need in order to actually do that. So one is the disk space. The next thing is when you're going to load those models, this is, you go to the chat side in LM Studio, And this is where we need to then load a model that we've got. So you can see the 3 models I just showed that I've downloaded on my machine. We need to load those. But if you're new to LM Studio, the first thing you want to do before you do that is you need to configure the system to utilize the resources you have on your machine. By default, LM Studio is going to use CPU only. If you've got a GPU on your machine, then you definitely want to be using that, but you need to tell it. You don't get it by default. So you need to come across to your settings. You need to scroll down on the right-hand side here under System Prompt until you get to Advanced Configuration, and then look at the hardware settings, and you need to enable GPU offload. I've gone for a 50-50 mix on mine, but like I say, this is off by default. My laptop that I'm running here today is it's an aging Lenovo X1 Extreme 2. It's got 32 gigs of RAM, but it does have a dedicated GPU as well. So I've configured this to use that, and we'll see why that's important in a minute. So, well, actually, we're going to do it right now. I'm going to load one of these models up, and when you load the model, you're choosing a model that you want to be able to load all into memory, either on your GPU or on your system, so that it's quicker and more efficient in order to interact with. So if you have a machine without a GPU, with not much RAM, this is going to be absolutely painful. So that's something to keep in mind. So I'm going to load a model. I'm going to show you, as I load the model, what that does when you load it, and show you that it does actually load into the GPU in this case. So I'm going to load the DeepSeek Coder model. I'm going to accept their system prompt. And then I check at my system resources, and we can see that my GPU memory usage rockets straight up. That's because it's loaded that model onto my GPU. We can see that it's using 4.34 gigs of RAM. It's not using any CPU at the moment because it's not doing anything. All we've done is load the model into LM Studio. The next thing we want to do is we need to give it a system prompt. So this is the system prompt that I showed on the slide a few minutes ago, where we are setting the scene for the model. So I've put this in here as this prompt so that it knows what we expect of it. So if I press enter on that, we can see that it's processed that, it's summarized that long prompt into 337 tokens that it's going to put into the model as we use it. So basically that's it. We've loaded a model, we've done it as efficiently we can on the host, we've given it the prompt, now we've got it to get to do what we want it to do. So that's where I'm going to now give it the query that I also showed in the slides just before, where we're going to give it an example JSON object to create an access profile. And let's see what it comes up with. So this is transfer, it's put that into 694 tokens. I'm going to press enter, and it's going to start processing. I'm going to jump back here to my performance of my machine, and we can see that the CPU has jumped, but we've also seen a little uptick as well in the GPU here. So we see the GPU is doing a lot of the work, the CPU did a little bit of the start of the work, and my memory hasn't really changed. Jumping back, we can still see it's processing. So we can see it's using 30% of my processor. It's only using 4 gigs of my RAM, but we still don't have a response yet. So yes, we've got a big system prompt. We've also given it a query and a semi-complex JSON object to do, and it's thinking about it. And it's going through its model, it's going through its parameters, it's working out what the answer could be for what our query is. So it's giving us an answer. It's giving us a bit of an introduction to it. And now it's starting to create a PowerShell function called new access profile. We can see it's going to expect as part of that function some parameters that it deems that we need in order to create the access profile based off the example that we gave it. And we can see that it's also doing the type of parameters do, whether it's a string, whether it's Boolean, whether it's whether it's a PowerShell object. But we're still just at the beginning. So this has been running now for maybe a minute, and we're still at the beginning of it, giving us an example. And we can see that it's absolutely, it's giving our machine a bit of a run for its money. And this is on a machine that at the moment is running LM Studio. It's got VS Code, it's got a couple other things, but not a lot running on it. If you're a developer or an IT pro, you're probably doing this on the same machine that you're running your collaborative tools on. You're probably running Outlook, maybe Teams, Slack, other Office products. It's going to probably even be slower than this. If you're running a desktop that's really grunty and you've got a GPU, it's a bit of a gaming machine, you might get some more performance out of it, but it's still not good. So when we talked about when you're thinking about using large language models for what we're trying to achieve, one of the criteria that I showed was speed, and this one's not really doing the speed. I'm actually going to stop generating this here, and we'll just have a little bit of a scroll back to see where it got to. But we can see that the parameters it's giving is just the raw parameters. There's also nothing in here that we asked it to specifically do, is whether or not, the object types are mandatory, if there's any validation around some of those that are needed. All it's doing is giving us parameters, potentially an object type, and that's it. And we haven't even got to the bit where it actually then takes those parameters and then would format them into an object that we may or may not be able to use. So that's DeepSeek Coder. I'm going to eject that model. I'm going to load up the Code Llama one. I'm going to keep our current system prompt, which we have, so we don't have to reload that. And we'll see if that gives us a different answer. So again, the model's loading. We go back here, we can see that the old model was removed from memory, and then the new model is loading, and it looks like it is about done. So again, with the same system prompt, I'm just going to hit enter on that, tab on that, so that it processes it. And then I'm going to give it the same query again, saying here is an example access profile. I want you to create a function that would let us do that. And we'll see if this one's any better. So again, it started processing. We see our CPU spike. We also see our GPU get a bit of a workout as well. So this is all to be expected. You're doing all this locally. Remember, it's a 3 or 4 gig model. It's loaded it all into memory. It's now passing all what we're trying to do through its parameters, trying to work out what an answer would be for what we've asked for. So I'm going to let this run for maybe a minute or so and see if the quality of the answer is any better than what the previous model gave us, being that we 2 different models, slightly different descriptions. When you look at the models on the home page, and I'll go back to this when this finishes, it actually gives you a very good overview of the different models, what they were trained on, what they were trained for, what their capabilities are, what the premises that they're trying to fulfill. And that gives you an idea whether a model may or may not be right for your purpose. In my experiments starting to work with this for the last 6 months, I've tried pretty much every coding LLM that's come out to see if it will give me the result that I wanted. And some, to varying degrees of success, look promising, but for most part they didn't really get me where I needed to be. And again, this comes back to the criteria and what we need. We need some accuracy, but we also need it to be fast, and we also want it to be relatively cheap. If we're using this a lot, we don't want it to be overly expensive. So we can see this one is returning a little bit more capable than the last one. This is now telling us that it's going to give us a function called new access profile. It's going to tell us that certain parameters are mandatory. By the looks at this one, it's looking like everything is mandatory, which is, as we know, when we'll look at the spec again in a few minutes, not everything is mandatory. The example we gave it was an example to create an access profile with certain configuration. It doesn't necessarily mean that everything is absolutely required to create every access profile. You can have multiple different access profiles that do different things. They have different configuration from each other. Obviously, this has no knowledge of that. It's just taking the one example we gave it. But at the same time, it's making everything mandatory. And everything is a custom object, which, again, is not what we're after. We want things like Booleans or strings, multi-valued objects. Not everything is a PS custom object. So I'm going to stop generating that because I can already tell that that's not going to give us what we need. But as an example of using large language models locally, it's a good example of what it takes to do that, what you need to have from a capability and capacity of your host in order to do that, and what the sort of the downfalls were. So the good thing is it's free. The downside is it's slow, and it's not very accurate. So like I said, when you open up LM Studio, you can actually scroll down here and look at a number of the models that are existing. So this is the one of the models that we were just looking at then, which was DeepSeek Coder. This is the first one we looked at. So it says that there's a range of different models from 1 billion to 33 billion parameters. We were using the 7 billion, trained on a data set comprising 2 trillion tokens of 87% code, and then some natural language in English and Chinese. So it's designed for project-level code completion and filling, and they were supposed to give you some decent performance. So we saw for PowerShell, yeah, maybe not. The other one that I was running was the second one there, which was the Code Llama. So this is from Meta AI. And these are advanced and filling capabilities, large input context, and ability to follow instructions and programming tasks without prior training. So they do state that it's good for, there are fine-tuning for different languages like Python, but again, there's different sizes as well. So it's supposed to be good, but for PowerShell, yeah, it's not our bag. So moving on, what another method is, and I briefly did this in the presentation we talked about before, is using ChatGPT. So here's an example that I put in previously that said, I'm trying to use ChatGPT to sort of say, maybe we can get that to do what we want. We give it the context, so I'm giving it the context through this UI, where you don't give the system prompt differently, you give it a context here, and then it's giving me some security best practices and everything else, telling me, based on this profile that they are, it's giving me some recommendations of security best practices and efficiency techniques for PowerShell. So then when I ask it a question, and I give it the example of the JSON object, then it comes up with its version of a create new access profile. We can see that it is also making everything mandatory, when we know that not all of these items are mandatory. It's then taking the input that you would provide to this function and building out the structure of the response. So this isn't too bad, but it's also not as good as it could be. And that's again because we're using generative AI for a programming type task. It's not using the right hammer for the right nail. But we'll come back to that because there is a way to work around this. The next one I want to show is there was a project that came out last year. It was called Ollama and Ollama Web UI. Ollama is another large language model that you can platform that you can run locally, and you can plug in any of the large language models into it. So effectively, you're running like a capability to do the same models that we had previously, but rather than using LM Studio and that GUI, it is basically a command line process that you load the model into, and then you can query it using web services. There was an open source project that created a web front end for that called Ollama Web UI. And what that allowed you to do is basically have a click and drag and drop and other functionality to download models directly and do all that with a nice interface that made using it a lot easier. That product has now evolved. So where it was formerly called Olama Web UI, it's now called Open Web UI. And what they've done is they've extended, this is an open source project. They allow you to still use the Web UI to do orchestration or interaction with Olama, but you can also do pretty much anything else. So you can also do large language models that exist online as part of SaaS solutions, and it also, as the demos showing here on their GitHub, allows you to do multimodal pieces as well. So you can drag in an image and query it, and it will give you a response of what it sees in the image or such. So the way that you run this, the documentation here is very good, and there is a full doc site off that as well. I'm running it as Docker. So I'm running a Docker container with Open Web UI on it, and I'm probably going to call it Olama Web UI many times because that was how I originally knew it. So this is it running locally on my machine in a container. We can see that it's not doing hardly anything. Well, it's loaded, but it isn't doing anything at the moment. So once you have it running, maybe with Docker, I can let you go out and work out how to do that. The documentation is very good. Then you are going to, with that running, you can hit the Web UI from your local machine. So here is what that looks like. So looks a little bit like ChatGPT in a way, in that you have your chat sessions. It gives you some quick start guides, some things it can do, and it's asking how it's going to help. But when you load this up, by default, there's no models. So you've got the container running. You then need to give it a model or some instruction on how to do that. So you need to configure that, and you configure that through this front Web UI. So if we click on your profile and you go to settings, this is where you can then select models and give them the configuration so that they can start using a model. So I've got a light LLM model loaded here, and that lets you basically query that model for what it is. This model isn't good for what we're trying to achieve, so I'm not going to show that. But what I am going to show is using OpenAI Web UI with OpenAI ChatGPT, and that's a mouthful. So this is where you need to do that. So if you go to your connections, by default you're going to see this, which is to the Docker host that's running underneath. There's this OpenAI piece here, and it's a little bit easy to just gloss over and not understand it because you miss this show bit on the side. And this is where you can give it your API key for OpenAI into here, and then allow this to be your local interface into OpenAI. So you need to generate an API key for OpenAI. You do that through the OpenAI platform page. You create an API key, and then basically you're just pasting it into the config that I just showed you with the endpoint that's there as well. Now, there's been a change with the way that OpenAI are doing their costing and charging. Initially, when I first started playing around with this more than a year ago, you could sign up. You got a number of credits that you could use over a period of time. I think it was time bound around about 3 months. So you got a number of credits that will give you a chance to explore, start leveraging it, understand how it works, and basically sort of a little bit, get you hooked. They've recently changed their billing model so that you actually now need to pre-purchase those credits. So once your initial credits run out, you build on demand. So if you if you started using the API and you used it 10 times today and 3 days, whatever, you'll build at the end of the month for what you used. They've changed that model. You've got to buy the credits in advance, and then you draw down on that based on what you use. But to give you an idea on what that actually looks like, I put in $10 credit on the 1st of April. I've still got, I've used 6 cents. To be fair, I haven't done a lot in the last few weeks. But at the same time, even prior to that, you can see the most I used in any period was in February with, it's going to take me to my receipt, but that was for another presentation and demo I built, and I was using OpenAI heavily for doing image creation. So using AI programmatically to create images based on different things. So if you were creating, I think I would have created 100 or something images using DALL-E, and it cost me $2. So even if you're building a lot of these and start using this as I'm going to show it, you can use it pretty heavily and it's not going to break the bank. It's probably going to cost you, maybe a coffee or a pint of craft beer a month. So it's nothing to get too worried about. Keep an eye on it. Obviously prepaying it means that if you use it all up, then it's gone and you need to add more credits, but you're not going to then get a bill subsequently at the end of the month if you've gone really heavy for $100 or something like that. So using this interface, like I showed, I've put in my OpenAI key. That then lets me select a model using all the OpenAI models. So you can see just by putting my API key in there, I can now select all these different models for use through my local UI, go out to OpenAI and will give me the result. So the one that I'm going to use is the GPT 3.5 Turbo 16K 0613. This is the model that I've found gives me the most predictable results and the most accurate results. And I'll show you how to refine that further as we go through that. So just like we did before, we still need to give it a prompt. So we've selected our model. We need to give it our prompt to give it the context and tell it what we are expecting of it. And it's coming straight back with, yep, I understand that. I'm highly skilled. What do you want to do? What do you want to know? So we're going to give it the same query that we gave the other one. We're using LM Studio, the other models. We give it that query, and we're going to give it an example of the JSON object to create an access profile. And let's see what it comes up with. Instantly you can see that it knows what we're talking about and it's pretty much done. So what it's done is it's given us a new function. It's called new access profile. It's got some parameters. We can still see that the majority of these are true. And that's because also because the one we gave it had everything filled for what they needed for what they were creating. But we do see that we've got Boolean, string, we've got arrays, multi-valued objects. So it's also better than what we had before with the other models. We can see that then the code of what it's doing, when you provide the parameters to this function, it's going to build out the object and it's going to return the object. So it then also gives us some guidance on how to use it. So you need to create the input to the function. It's now giving us guidance on what we need to do that. So we create an owner object with the type as identity, the ID, and the name. We do that for source, entitlements, etc., etc. So prescriptively, it's saying here's a function, and then here's what you need to provide values to and what that looks like to provide to the function to then give you the object that you can then use to create the access profile, which is awesome. So the problem with this, though, is this is all based off the example that we had from the developer IdentityNow portal, which is based on this example here, where that was the access profile that they were creating. Now, our access profile is going to be a little bit different. How do we do that, and how do we get it to help us create a function to generate the payload for one of ours? And this is effectively now the process to take everything that I've talked about in the last hour and actually have it do and give us the result that we need. So the approach is to create whatever the object is in the IdentityNow portal with the configuration that's respective of what you're trying to do. So if you're trying to create 15 access profiles, or say 3 sources, or 50 entitlements or whatever, you go and create those through the IdentityNow portal in the structure with the base sort of template, so to speak, of what you're looking for. So let me just sign in here. My session's timed out. Let's look at my, yep. I'm just going to log in, do MFA. And I'm MFA'd. And I'm in. So if I go into the admin side of the portal and I look at my access profiles, I've got one here called Demo AI Access Profile. So if we have a look at the details of this, this is what I'm sort of showcasing as a bit of an example of what an example template may be that I would want to do multiple of. So it's got a name, it's got an owner, description, and it's associated with a source. It's then got a series of entitlements with it. This one's only got 2 at the moment. The access profile itself is enabled. And then we've got some criteria around whether or not access requests are allowable, whether they need approval, what the approval is. In this case, it's manager and access profile owner, and whether or not comments are required. Excuse me. So this is sort of a very good example of like just a base level, simple-ish object type, but we want to create 10 of them. Obviously with different criteria, maybe a different owner, different entitlements, different names, potentially even different sources. So what we do is we need to query this and get this as the example that we're going to give to AI to say generate a function that will allow us to create access profiles that look like this. We can substitute in some of those values, but that's what we're trying to achieve. So in order to do that, we need to query the API. So I'm using my IdentityNow PowerShell module to do this, and I've got a command here that I've got a one-liner that says get me the IdentityNow access profiles from my tenant, select the name, select the profile which is called the Demo AI Access Profile, which is the one that we just looked at here. And then what I'm trying to achieve from that is the JSON version of the configuration of that object. So if I run this, it's going out and it's returned that. So if I show the value of that, then this here is the JSON object for that access profile. What I then do is I'm going to say, okay, if that's what it looks like, then this is one I did earlier for exactly the same access profile. It's the same owner, the same source, and it's got the same 2 entitlements that we had. If I have a look at this, we see we've got 2 entitlements. Those are the IDs of the same entitlements. So this is the one that I did earlier. And the good thing using this method is you can do this repeatedly. You get pretty much exactly the same thing back from AI when you're this very prescriptive about what you want and how you're doing it. So this is what the object looks like. So if we were to provide this now to our web portal, where are we? Our Open Web UI. If I do the same thing, so I paste in this, and then I'll give it the same request. It should keep that from the context and know that I'm doing the same thing, but just to be sure, I'm going to give it the same command with a different example and see what it comes back with. So again, very quick. And now we can see that we've got pretty much the same thing, but with the configuration that we had. This differs from the previous one, which had other criteria associated with it, and other elements that we're not doing on ours. So this is now very specific to our approach. What you also notice here, though, is because we've given an example of an object that we've got that we've already created. To create a new access profile, it's requiring an ID. It's like, no, you get the ID after you create an object. You don't provide an ID of what you want it created with. So there's a certain number of attributes like that that don't actually make sense. So this is where we go back and we reference the guide for the access profiles, where you can see that the ID is not on here under the create. So there's no value that you need to provide to the API to create an access profile that's called ID. Likewise, some of these are also not required. So description is not required. Entitlements is not required. We've got entitlements on ours, so we want to do that. But there's other elements that may not be required. So what you need to do is you need to then, we've done the get object to use it as an example to help us make it. We need to refine that down to the ones that are actually associated with the API that are actually required. So to do that, what I've done is I've reduced that down to this. So all I've done is I've taken what we've previously got, I've taken out the ID, because you only get that after you create the object. Modified is an internal one of when that object may or may not have been modified. Again, when you're creating it, you don't have to provide that because that doesn't exist yet. Same with created, and same with the source name. So source name doesn't exist on the documentation because it uses source ID when you're doing the creation of it. To make it easier readable for us, then this value source name is added by the system on the back end, so that when you're looking at it, it makes sense to you because you don't know what the ID is relating to, you want the name. So what I've done is reduced it down to the items by cross-referencing with the API, saying this is the minimum that we need to specify for the access profile that we're trying to create. And if I go and put that then back into our solution, back into our AI window, I'm going to do exactly the same thing again, now obviously with a much rationalized example. And hit go. Now I'm getting exactly what's required out. So I can see, there's the ones that I moved out before are no longer present. I've got one called New Access Profile. On this, sometimes it will give you different verbs for the same thing. That's the good thing about PowerShell. It is very flexible. Sometimes it will give you New Access Profile. Sometimes other times it will give you Create-Access Profile. But for all intents and purposes, then inside that it's still the same. It's a bit of creative license on the verb they're using for the actual function name itself. So we can see the result of that, and then how to generate the entitlements, and then how to call this function providing values in order to get it to do what we want it to do. So the next piece is, okay, we've got our example function. We need to then create the configuration items that we want to do programmatically. This will let us do things that, on bulk. You've got a source of information of all the ones that you want to create, and you're just pulling that information in, building those out, and doing that as part of an automation. So what I've got is the one that it created for me earlier. So like I said, sometimes it gives you create, sometimes it gives you new, but then everything else under here is pretty much the same. So I'm going to load this function into memory. So that's created that function. So now in order to call this function, I need to provide it with each of these items. So I need to know the source that I'm associating with that. So I'm using my my module to get all the sources. So here's all the sources that are from my system with get IdentityNow sources command. So I've got many in the system. But what I've done is I've used PowerShell to refine that down to the external user source, which is the one that's associated with the access profile we're creating. And all I need from that is the actual ID. So if I was to say, sources where object equals external ID, and see what the value of that is, then it is, there's that source itself, just that source. It's a delimited file source. but I just want the ID. This command will just give us the ID. So if I look at the source ID after running this, that's just the ID of my source, which is 1735, which is the same one that, that we got, because we're creating another access profile referencing the same source. I need to do the same thing for an owner ID. I'm going to skip through this a little bit quicker, but you get the point where using the capabilities of a PowerShell module or an SDK or whatever, we can query to get the data that we can then use programmatically to do what we need to do. So I'm searching IdentityNow user profiles for my name, and I'm looking for the object that has the alias of that, and I want the ID. That's the particular user account that I want to be the owner of this access profile. And then for entitlements, I'm searching all the entitlements, but then I'm saying, give me the entitlements where the source is associated with the source that I've specified above, which is the external users. So then I'm getting, so if I run this, it's going to go out, dynamically get all those entitlements. Oh, and if I have a look at then E, then those are all the entitlements. But for each of those entitlements, we don't need all the entitlement information. We just need the ID of those entitlements. Those are the ones that we're referencing in the create. So to do that, I'm just iterating through each of those entitlements and just pulling out the ID and putting it into a collection that we can then pass to our new AI function. So if I've done that now, if I look at the entitlements to add, that will just be a list of all the IDs. So then the final steps. The creative license around maybe what we call it, what the approval schemes are. I'm using similar approval schemes, but this shows that using the function that we built, generated or had AI generate for us, we can then just pass it criteria for that, and we can change out the configuration based on our needs. We can create it for a different source, we can give it a different approval scheme, we can give it a different description and name, and also do a different approval scheme for revoking that back. So I'm calling the function, I'm creating a new object, which is the output from our create access profile function, which will give us the object that we then need to convert to JSON to provide to the module that I'm using, again mine, to create the access profile. So if I run all this here together and run this, then it's created this new PowerShell object called new AP, and this is the configuration that we've just given it above. Oop. Do that again, there we go. So the approval scheme is manager, then source owner. Deny comments are required. Dev days external users is the name. These are the entitlements that we return. So whereas the previous one we had was 2 entitlements, we've got a lot more than that now. But we've still got the same owner, and we've still got a relatively similar configuration. So if we have a look in the SailPoint IdentityNow portal here, close that. I'll do a refresh on this. We don't have any access profile, which is called dev days external users. None. So let's create it. I'm going to take this PowerShell object, which has our configuration. I've got to convert it to JSON because that's the payload we give the commandlet to talk to the API. So I do create my JSON object by converting my PowerShell object. I then have a JSON representation of that, which looks very familiar, except it's got a lot more entitlements to what we created manually, and then have dynamically updated with our function. So let's create it. Create a new IdentityNow access profile with our config. And it's done. So if I go back to the portal here and I search on this, we've now got our dev days external users. We can, it's got 87 entitlements was the number that were associated with the source that we've not dynamically done. If we look at that, we edit it, We can see it has the name that we gave it, the owner, the description, and it's associated with the source that we configured. It is enabled, and then there are a lot of entitlements, because remember, we queried all entitlements on that source, and then we've associated them all with this access profile. In terms of managing the access requests, we require approval. It's manager and source owner. We allow requests, and then there's comments required, and removal is via an access profile owner. So that's everything that we queried from our template, but then we've changed a lot of that parameters around it. And in order to get all the structure of all that, AI's helped us do that. It's created the function which builds it out in the right syntax in order to do that. So I think that's pretty awesome. If we jump back to the slides, I will bring this home. I'm going to fast forward through a bunch of these, which are screenshots that we all did as demos. Like I said, running it all locally, more than a few minutes later. Sometimes there's a lot more than that. These are the demos we walked through and saw the different iterations of getting to the result that we can actually use. So here's my quick start guide. Alama Web UI is very low footprint, low resources method of interacting with both local LLMs as well as things like OpenAI and online ones. I highly recommend that. It's in development, it is evolving fast, and the capabilities coming to it are fantastic, like you would expect from a lot of the online ones you use, but you can do it all locally. So things like, even they showed in the description, multimodal graphics, those sorts of things, all through that web UI, absolutely fantastic. The model I've got listed in here is the 16K one. I did have initially good success with that when I was doing my initial rounds of testing. I've reduced that back now to just the GPT-3.5 Turbo 0613. But just keep in mind that maybe you need to keep that refined as things evolve and as new models come out. So that's something that you also need to think about, is when you have something working and there's new models coming out, give them a try, see if they're better than what you've got. If they are, maybe start looking at those. Otherwise, keep going with what you've got. The cost for using this, we showed my resources, what it was costing me for some of what I've done with OpenAI and automation. It's cents, dollars at most, and single-digit dollars. The prompt, it's in the slide deck. That's the prompt that I've had the most success with. It's taken a number of iterations to get me to that point, but that should also set you up as well. You can tailor that prompt to, change it for different nuances as time evolves, or if you want to do something slightly derivative of what I've shown here. And then the example of the chat, what you give it to get the result. You can also interact with it. So I've shown like a sort of a golden path one-shot method of giving it something and expecting almost excellence back. You can use refinements to sort of show me how to create the array. In the examples I showed, it did give it examples on how to create the objects to then pass the function to get it to do what you want to do. But if you don't understand it, you can say, please explain to me, how to create this this object or this array or this object to pass to the function. And it will describe it to you and will give you examples and effectively give you assistance to do that. So if you're a very junior person entering into that, that's a good way of learning, because it's not a case of give it something, it gives you a result, you test it, it doesn't work, why doesn't it work? You can use AI to actually refine that. Ask it why it does, this is, what can I do if I get this problem, or how can I refine this for certain needs? Give me an example how to create this object. Show me how to create an array for X. Those are ways that you can refine the responses and take it there. You don't have to do everything I've done, obviously, to get to this point. You can take this as your starting point and go ahead and start kicking some goals. So my recommendations are: start simple, start local, but don't rely on having to have local LLMs. You can interact like I've shown with ones that are online. That gives you the benefit of both worlds, the flexibility. Again, can't say enough about OpenAI Web UI, but continue to evaluate and refine it. we've come a long way in a year. So think generative AI really started about 18 months ago. What have we done with it in the last year? What's now available in terms of other providers providing similar capabilities with different knowledge bases? Where will we be in 3 months' time? Like I said, when I started writing this 3 months ago and what I've had to change to get it to be current for where we are today, that will again continue to happen as we move forward. Some of the complexities that I've shown, I expect that to get better as well. As the models get more fine-tuned and more specific to certain scenarios, then the output should be a lot more accurate, a lot quicker, and a lot easier to use. And remember, AI is not going to replace you, but a person using AI will. So I really strongly encourage you to start your journey with leveraging these new capabilities, working out how you can integrate them into your workflows and how they can help you be more successful or help you to do things a lot faster, and then maybe get off to do other things that you may want to do. So it's been my pleasure talking to you all today. I hope you've got some good takeaways. I hope I've given you some inspiration to go out there and think a little bit outside the box and start using AI to assist you in your development and assist you in your speed of going from idea to integration to orchestration of IdentityNow and APIs. This work can also be leveraged for other languages. Obviously, you'll need to change some of the prompts and some of the chats, but you could do a similar thing if you wanted to leverage, for example, another SDK from SailPoint to also interact with IdentityNow, but not use PowerShell. You could still use AI to do that. You'll need to do probably a little bit more work like I've done in order to do that, but hopefully you've also got a leg up and an idea on the process that I've been through to get there, and you can be successful too. Thank you very much for your time.